Welcome to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. Today, CIBC Wood Gundy's Ross Clark takes a look at the future of the U.S. dollar and will gold break out again. Canadian Taxpayers Federation Director for BC, Jordan Bateman, takes a look at the latest government misspending and whether ICBC and Hydro really had to raise their rates. We'll talk to Ross Clark right after this.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome to This Week in Money, the source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
We're chatting with Ross Clark, investment advisor at CIBC Wood Gundy in Vancouver. Ross, welcome back to This Week in Money.
Nice to be with you, Jim.
The U.S. dollar has had a huge rise over the last few years. Is that going to continue?
Well, my view is that this consolidation, we had that big rise 2 years ago. We've had a consolidation since then. And the view here is that for all that it may have some minor moves to the downside, the big move, I think, still is to the upside. And, when the U.S. finally gets around to raising interest rates, that might be one of the catalysts that helps it out. This Friday when the employment numbers came out, it looked as though there wouldn't be an imminent rate rise, at least in the near term. It would be pushed out once again, possibly to December. And with that, the U.S. dollar sold off, but then came back surprisingly well in the second half of the day and closed up very, very nicely as far as the basket was concerned. But within the complex, I mean, you had the euro was down, the yen was down about 70 points on the day, and we're still looking for about a 5% break continued down on the yen relative to the U.S. dollar. The other side of the coin is that we had some really good advances in the energy complex, and that's helped out the Canadian dollar, which was up 55 basis points on the day.
Will it help oil prices that President Putin has said he's in favor of freezing production levels?
Well, this is like anything. You're going to have between him, members of OPEC, everyone's going to be talking their story here for the next week or so as we move towards the OPEC meeting. When I take a look at it, clearly we've got that major low in place from the first part of this year. You've had your classic rally, your first pullback of any magnitude was down to 25% into the $40 level, and I think that you're going to still see this $42 to $43 level become a pretty good support right now. From a technical perspective, if it breaks, then we'll have to call uncle to that trade, but for now, that's a good support level, and the typical rallies in the oil would take us to at least December, and when you've had good move off a low like we have had this year, there's 5 times that we've seen that since the 1980s, and the typical action here would be that this next rally will take us back to the existing highs that we had close to that $50 level.
Gold and silver, of course, have had a terrific run this year. Is it going to continue?
I believe after a bigger pause than the one we've just seen, we saw the gold sell off to just kiss the $1,300 level on Thursday, made a nice little bounce off of that. And that was a good test of the February through May highs. It was a good test of a support line coming up from December. Silver corrected 38% of the whole run already since the lows that we saw back in December. And it's a good spot to have had a bounce. We had 9 consecutive days where we closed below 4 days earlier. That's what we call a sequential count. It happened as of Thursday, and from there you would expect to have at least a good knee-jerk reaction to the upside.
Ross, thanks for being on This Week in Money.
Nice to be with you, Jim.
My guest has been Ross Clark, investment advisor at CIBC Wood Gundy, Vancouver. Coming up, Jordan Bateman on This Week in Money.
Always consult your investment professional before making any investment decision.
GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
My guest is Jordan Bateman. He's the BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome to This Week in Money, Jordan.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jim.
Jordan, I know before we went on air, you said there are so many things that the government kind of wraps its little greedy fingers on when it comes to our money. But what would be the biggest thing that you think that we should be looking at when it comes to our tax dollars, how they're spent, and what would you do if you were BC Premier for a day?
Well, BC Premier for a day, there's a bunch of things I would love to see happen electoral reform-wise, but when it comes to money, I don't think you can talk about anything to do with the BC government without starting with debt. And the debt load is just continuing to go up. We actually have a running debt clock, bcdebtclock.ca, if listeners want to take a look for themselves. And, you know, under Gordon Campbell's reign, in about 2006, 2007, the BC Liberals had actually managed to get the debt down to about $33 billion. Today, the debt is approaching $70 billion with no sign of slowing. In fact, we put on about $500 million every quarter in debt. Now, this is despite 4 balanced budgets in a row. Despite the fact that we've had those balanced budgets, governments continue to borrow money at, frankly, an alarming rate. They'll bury it and say, oh, well, it's a percentage of GDP. It hasn't gone up that much. But, debt is debt, and when we owe other people money, it does reduce our spending power both today and in the future. So at a time where I think government and businesses alike need to become more flexible, more able to kind of roll with the punches and deal with the challenges of the future, we're actually tying the hands of future governments by forcing them to spend more and more money on debt servicing, paying for things that we didn't want to wait to save up for. So, job one, you got to deal with the debt. The BC government has a $700 million or so surplus. They've yet to announce, how much of that money they're going to apply to the debt. Given the fact it's an election year, one suspects not very much. Although in their last election platform, they had promised that 50% of all surpluses would go to paying down debt. So we are, job one should be forward thinking, which is how do we make sure government's in good shape tomorrow? How do we make sure the province is in good shape tomorrow? Getting debt under control would be a first step.
Well, I'm not really pleased as a taxpayer to see government ads funded by my tax dollars bragging about how good of a job they're doing. Shouldn't that just be something that should be accepted if they're doing a good job?
Yeah, the BC Liberals were way behind in the last election polling in 2013. Everyone expected them to lose, and they pulled out the miracle victory. So not surprisingly, they're going back to the well on a few of the things that worked for them then. Government advertising being one of the most notable. They spent tens of millions of dollars last time around. We all remember, wasn't it the dominoes falling ad, right? All the dominoes falling around the world because of all the terrible governments, and then it, hit the rock solid BC domino, and we stood up to the world trend. They're going back to the well on that. They're trying again to advertise, use taxpayer money to advertise these things. It's actually a very simple solution to this. Ontario has the correct solution, although they've just gotten rid of it due to political reasons. But what they used to do in Ontario is, if government wanted to advertise, they had to get the permission of the Auditor General. So the Auditor General would look at the ads, make sure that they were fair, that they were nonpartisan, that they were accurate, and often would weigh in whether or not they were even required, statutory ads. There's certain things that government needs to advertise under law. There's certain things the government does not need to advertise. But they would give a stamp of approval, and they turned down ads based on the fact that it looked too much like, the Liberal Party of Ontario's logo, or the color schemes were too similar to certain political parties. So to me, that would be an act that they should bring in. limit government advertising, make sure you have a third party like the Auditor General signing off on it, and let taxpayers know that when they see something on TV from their government, it's important and nonpartisan, and information that they need to know, not information that politicians want them to have.
Why does BC Hydro advertise? Who else can we go to get our power?
Yeah, why does BC Hydro advertise? Why does ICBC advertise? Remember BC Ferries had the sign all those years at Rogers Arena when the Canucks were playing. You're exactly right. These are not companies that need to advertise. They're monopolies. Certainly I can't imagine any human being in British Columbia who thinks to themselves, I got to ride BC Ferries next week because I saw that great ad during the Canucks game. That was great. That's just a complete, waste of money and whatnot. There's also, the corporate sponsorships. BC Hydro does sponsorships, ICBC, all these groups do. But, really what's the value for the taxpayer? This is just more government advertising, but a different package.
BC Hydro and ICBC are used as cash cows by the government. They withdraw hundreds of millions from those crown corporations every year, and then they slap us with higher rates for our car insurance and our power bills. Why can't they just pay that back and get to a point where we don't have to pay for increases anymore?
Well, yeah. So the BC government, to their credit, have started to talk about reducing the dividends. It's still talk, but at least they're talking. At least they're trying to move in that direction. They have set some standards. I'd go even further with ICBC. Studies show that British Columbians pay higher car insurance rates than you do in provinces where you have private insurers. The three most expensive jurisdictions in Canada to buy insurance are the three that have government-run auto insurance because, of course, there's no competition. So, I take a look at ICBC. Is ICBC still relevant in 2016? It was formed in the early 70s. You could nickname it that 70s corporation. A lot of their practices still seem rooted in, problems from 40 years ago. Is this the most efficient way, most effective way, most cost-effective way to actually, insure cars? I'm not sure. So, you'd want to, honestly, I'd do a study on that to see if there's any opportunity to make car insurance costs lower for the vast majority of British Columbians, rather than what we're seeing with ICBC. ICBC today has come out and said, hey, the real problem here, the reason we have to raise basic rates is too many of you people who are in accidents are hiring lawyers. Quit hiring lawyers. Well, people hire lawyers because they don't trust ICBC to do right by us. They're an insurance company that has a pretty shoddy record in the way they treat their customers. We don't really have much of an option to go elsewhere. Some of us, myself included, we buy our optional insurance through a private insurer. I do that more based on principle than huge cost savings. It saves me maybe a couple bucks a month. But we need to have a hard look at ICBC. The future of it, is it still relevant, and is it still cost efficient?
What about the huge debt that BC Hydro owes? Doesn't that leave all the taxpayers on the hook for it?
Yeah, Hydro is a mess with the massive debt and what they call deferral accounts. And, you talk about government debt and how it can start from, what's the old saying? The road to hell is paved with good intention. So BC Hydro initially started borrowing money in what's called deferral accounts in order to smooth out hydro rates. So some years they were finding that, they needed 11% increases in costs. Some years they only need 1% or they were even profitable. So what they tried to do is create these deferral accounts where they could defer the big spikes and try to smooth out rates for everyone. Perfectly legitimate, reasonable thing to do, but what's turned into is a place for government to borrow money, to take money out of ICBC or out of BC Hydro through dividends, and pass along those costs to consumers. Not every ratepayer of BC Hydro is a taxpayer, yet every ratepayer sees money going towards hydro taxes. So these are big problems. BC Hydro signed a bunch of independent power deals. Some were good, some were very, very bad. There's no way or BC Hydro seems reluctant to try to extricate themselves out of that. These are all things that need to get cleaned up. But you start by cutting that dividend from government, have government try to get along without it so that BC Hydro can start paying down the debt that they've incurred.
Well, also, hydro seems obsessed with hydro. How much solar, geothermal, or tidal power does BC's power company generate?
Well, they do. If they do any of that, it's through the independent power producer contracts. And Norm Farrell, a blogger from Vancouver Island, has done a masterful job of ripping into just how bad those contracts have been for BC Hydro ratepayers. Basically, BC Hydro is overpaid the market for that electricity. And that, of course, then gets passed on to us in higher costs. And, the independent power producers make out like bandits because they're getting more money than they could from, any other power agency in Canada. So, I want to be careful on that. Like, yes, there's geothermal, yes, there's solar, yes, there's wind that can be, exploited. Those do have negative environmental costs, some, more, some less than hydroelectric power. But right now, we haven't seen the kind of financing model for the sort of wide-scale boutique power that you would need.
Well, tidal power is one thing, though, I'm very disappointed in that we have, because of Vancouver Island, variable tides along the BC coast, which means you wouldn't have power outages during slack tides because province-wide we don't have a slack tide. There's always water coming in, going out, some of it very powerful. Take a look at Seymour Narrows, where the cruise ships have to time the tides, or they can't even get up enough power to go through. Those are natural places, and I've seen the Research Canada turbine that they use for tidal power. It doesn't interfere with marine life. You can put it right into the coast, under the rocks. You wouldn't even know it was there. So it doesn't even mess up the landscape like wind power plants do, or solar power, things like that.
Yeah, I'm not going to profess to be an expert on tidal power. You clearly have done more reading on it than I have, but I would say that anything to do with BC's coastline seems to take an inordinate amount of political will and social license, given the many vocal stakeholders involved. I mean, you can make the same argument, right? You could say, look, we have incredible oil and gas supplies offshore in British Columbia, more so even than Newfoundland, but there's been an oil and gas offshore moratorium for decades, and, it doesn't seem like anyone's in any rush or has much interest in lifting that. Obviously more intrusive than tidal power, but, again, it's the sacredness of the coastline. It's tough to convince British Columbians to mess with that.
We'll have more with Jordan Bateman next on This Week in Money.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
Welcome back to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. We're speaking with Jordan Bateman, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Jordan, what's your feeling on civil servants who double dip? In other words, say a retired police officer who's collecting a full pension, which was their last pay grade, which is a pretty good pension in itself. Then they go and sign on with somebody like the transit police or some other authority paid for by the taxpayer, and they start collecting a very large salary again.
Yeah, double dipping is one of the things that drives us the craziest at the Taxpayers Federation, because these pensions are a holdover from a time where government pensions were, they're still gold-plated, but at a time where the private sector had similar kind of pensions. The private sector has adapted; the public sector has not. And one of the most notable double dippers, of course, is Gordon Campbell, who gets a pension as former Premier of British Columbia, six-figure pension. but also collected, a large, I think, $250,000 a year salary as High Commissioner to London. He had a cook, he had a house, he had a driver, he had everything he needed there. Not complaining about Campbell, whether or not he's qualified to be ambassador to England, but he is double dipping, and you wish that there was some sort of mechanism in these public sector pensions to, at least suspend benefits when folks are working again for government. It's frustrating to us when we see a fire chief retire on a Friday, and they have a retirement party for him, and then he shows up back for work on a Monday on a contract with the same municipality, and that happens over and over again across the province. And that Monday, he's twice as expensive because he's collecting his pension and he's collecting this new contract or salary. This is something that needs to be addressed. Public sector pensions are something that governments hate to negotiate on because the unions are very powerful and consider them sacred. But I think this is something that the public could get behind as far as pension reform goes. I think the case can be made to the taxpayer that, we need to do this, and it's worth standing up to the unions on.
Well, the city of Chicago is effectively bankrupt because it's had to pay pensions in a similar circumstance.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, BC is a little better off than the rest of Canada as far as pension goes, just because of the pension structure here, public pension structure. But still, it costs taxpayers millions and millions and millions, billions of dollars to go into these funds. They get paid out at the end. I'm not going to begrudge a frontline worker, who works for, 30 years for the municipal government and has a pension of $30,000 or $35,000. Like, those aren't the ones I think are really egregious to the public. It's these high-end executives, it's kind of the top-end folks, or the people who, retire, quote-unquote retire, but then seem to still have the energy to do full-time work, a few days later.
Well, when it comes to high-end executives, what about the example of Translink, where their CEO resigned and then stayed on to, quote, help the new CEO, and then stayed on as a consultant? Yeah,
good old Ian Jarvis. So he didn't even resign. He got fired, but they demoted him essentially to become a special advisor to the board. He was paid for 15 months of his full CEO salary. His advice to the board, according to calendars that we obtained through Freedom of Information, was worth about 3 or 4 hours total in that 15 months, including a half-hour lunch at a white spot with one board member, where no doubt they were talking about the real heavy-duty issues out in public, right? So stuff like that is a joke. It's expensive, and it should be outlawed. And we've long been proponents of fixed-term executive contracts with no severance or pension payouts. You do RSPs, match contributions to RSPs up to a certain percentage of income like the private sector does. We have no problem with that. But giving these guys access to big pensions is crazy. David Hahn, of course, the old BC Ferry CEO, was the worst for this, where his pension was so lucrative. Was it $300,000 a year he gets in pension? It was so lucrative he actually had to be part of 2 pension funds because he couldn't just be part of one. It was practically illegal to do so. So these are the frustrating things about pensions. When people talk about pensioners, Jim, here's the problem. They think of the little old lady down the street who is on a fixed income and just struggling to get by. We're not talking about those kind of pensioners. We're talking about people in the executive service, the high end of the public service, who have managed to frankly take hundreds of thousands of dollars out of government, out of taxpayers' wallets, and will continue to do so thanks to the way their pensions are structured.
What about these high-powered executives who resign on their own and then get severance pay? What's the deal with that?
Yeah. If you quit a job, you shouldn't get severance, but that's one of those things that government has done. Someone negotiated at some point, and it's just become the standard across the board. But you're absolutely right. That's another one of those things that needs to stop, and that's why you need tougher rules. Now, the BC government, to their credit, have tried. They've tried with their own staff, the core ministry staff, to hold the line on wages and benefits. They've done a pretty admirable job compared to most other governments across Canada. But they're only one part. Municipalities, they've had trouble, exercising any control over their crown corps. There's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Jordan, what's your feeling on bridge tolls? We have the Port Mann and Golden Ears bridges where people go out of their way by tens of kilometers to avoid those tolls. Should our bridge system be part of the highway system and just be included?
Yeah, user pay makes sense to a degree. However, the bridge tolls on the Port Mann, well, let's take the Port Mann. The bridge tolls on the Port Mann are unfair for a pretty simple reason. They're not meant to only cover the cost of the Port Mann Bridge. They cover the cost of the entire $2.5 billion upgrade to Highway 1 that stretches from Langley all the way to Grandview. But, if you happen to live in Coquitlam and get on the highway there and drive to Grandview every day, you don't have to pay the toll. Whereas, if you're a poor schmuck who lives in Surrey and you're crossing the bridge to Coquitlam, you do. So right there, it fails a key test of fairness in how it is structured. I did have a laugh. The transit folks, the Translink apologists, as I call them for lack of a better term, they were all over the Port Mann Bridge because it's losing, they say, $80 or $90 million a year. What that means is it's not bringing enough tolls to cover its debt interest payment at this point. And they consider this a terrible thing and what a disaster, and we should shut the Port Mann down, I guess. I don't know. The problem with that theory is, look, if that's the way it's going to go and we want every mode of transportation to cover its own costs, then we need to pull out the taxpayer subsidies from BC Ferries. We need to pull out the taxpayer subsidies from Translink, and that's going to spike those fares as well. So if these people are really calling on, every part of the transportation system to be to show true cost recovery, there's a lot of lower income folks who are going to be hurt by that. So we need to be very careful on what we do in that. What I would like to see the Port Mann and Golden Ears do is try some different funding models. Like, could you lower the toll for off-peak hours and see if that would draw some traffic into the times when the bridges aren't as busy? Who knows? There's some experiments that can be done that we can see, what the result is. The truth is, a lot of these transportation folks just can't understand why people would, waste more of their time driving around to the Patello, sitting in traffic, when they could spend the money and zip over the Port Mann Bridge. The reason why is people in BC are so cash-strapped that they would rather spend their time to do that because they just do not have the physical dollars to be able to afford to do the same thing, to pay the toll and skip the queue. That is a real problem in BC, and I think it's sort of, in the Lower Mainland, underpins this talk about tolling and road pricing. Folks just do not have the kind of disposable income they used to have. 42% of their income disappears in various taxes, fees, and levies. The last thing they want to do is give more, even if it means wasting an extra half hour, 45 minutes a day dealing with the traffic of the Patello. So that's my theory on it. That's as a, South Fraser guy. I supported the building of the Port Mann Bridge. It was a huge bottleneck. The Golden Ears, Maple Ridge and Langley continue to boom. Surrey as well. It's a connection there. I'm not as keen on the Massey Bridge replacement because it seems very large and very expensive at a time where government is borrowing too much money as it is. But, these are all discussions that need to continue.
Well, one thing I find very mean and vindictive is for the first time in 9 years, the BC government has upped the payments to disabled people by $77 a month starting September 1st. However, if they have to take transport, they no longer get a free transportation pass, so most of that money is going to be clawed back to the government again.
Yeah, I think they come out $27 or $28 a head, which is still more than I think the BC NDP promised to increase rates during their last election campaign, which tells you one of the problems with the NDP campaign last time. One of the things, if I were premier for a day, I would actually spend my own money. I would hire a tattoo artist. I would have the tattoo artist come in. I would have every cabinet member and every MLA put their hand on a table, and we would put a tattoo on their hand that says, "Don't do stupid stuff." The bus clawback thing was one of the stupid things that government did. It's caused no end of concern among that group of people. These are people who are the poorest of the poor, people who were trying to help get a step up. They need transportation in order to go to things like medical appointments or job interviews or just daily life, shopping, all those things, taking kids to school. They rely on that. And it just seemed vindictive and mean-spirited for really a very little amount of money. So, yeah, that's one of those things that government's got to figure out a better way of doing. Be just a little bit kinder and a little bit gentler. Don't waste money. Premier Clark has spent $1 million over the past 5 years on social media photographers and videographers. Maybe doing less of that and more of these things that actually help people is the way to go.
Well, and it doesn't just go by political stripe. Back in the days of NDP Premier Ujjal Dosanjh, Ottawa upped the payments to disabled people by, I think, $500 or $600 a month, and the BC government immediately clawed that back, saying, we'll use that money to improve the services to those people. I've asked disabled people, did your services improve by $500 to $600 a month? And, of course, the answer was no.
Yeah, then isn't that always the way? You talk about downloading from the federal government. The province has complained about that for years. There's claims that they pass it on to the city, but there have been times where the feds have come to the table with more money, and provinces have taken full advantage of that to reverse the trend. Right now in Alberta, they're having a major problem. We talk about our Translink funding situation here, where Trudeau came in and said he's going to fund 50%. Federal taxpayers will fund, which actually means borrow 50% of the money towards future transportation infrastructure. That allowed the BC government to lower the local share from 33% to 17%, which is a big change already since the plebiscite last year. In Alberta, the provincial government said nope, some of that's going to apply to our provincial share. So Trudeau's 50% will be matched by 25% from the province, which means cities who thought they were going to get the Vancouver deal of only having to put in 17% are having to find 25%. Doesn't sound like much, 8 percentage points, but when you're talking about billions of dollars, that really does add up for local taxpayers.
Also, another thing I asked Ujjal Dosanjh when he was NDP Premier of BC is why don't you up the personal exemption on income taxes paid to the province? In Alberta, at the time, you had to earn $25,000 or more before you paid provincial tax. In BC at the time, it was around $8,000. And he said, Jim, I can't do that because it would cost BC over $3 billion.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, the exemption grew during the HST years. It was part of the deal, Campbell trying to claim that, HST would be revenue neutral. So he increased the personal exemption. But, once we turf the HST, it's gone back down to whatever it is, say, $9,000 or $10,000. Look, Alberta had a single rate tax and said, if you didn't make a certain amount of money, if you didn't make $25,000 a year, you didn't pay any provincial tax. If you made more than $25,000 a year, and you could set that at 30 or 35 or whatever you think the proper spot should be, you paid, whatever it was, 10% tax rate, no matter how much money you made. It simplified the provincial tax system greatly. Was widely considered to be part of the famed Alberta Advantage that Ralph Klein turned into such an economic boom in Alberta, and not coincidentally, government's change in Alberta. When the dying days of the progressive conservative government, they scrapped the single rate tax, and to no one's surprise, the whole budget, Alberta budget's gone into the toilet, and they blame it on oil. Truth is, Alberta used to manage to balance their budget with $40 a barrel oil. Now, though, it's a massive deficit for them because they've spent too much money and they've constricted economic activity. So the more you can do to encourage people to go out and create jobs and make money and empower the economy, the better. Single rate tax has proven to be a pretty good tool for that.
We'll have more with Jordan Bateman next on This Week in Money.
GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
This Week in Money is archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com.
You're listening to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. We're speaking with Jordan Bateman. He's the BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, getting back to provincial and federal standards and interprovincial trade. Right now in Canada, we have more trade barriers between the provinces than we do with countries like Canada and China or Canada and the European Union. Is it time to get rid of these barriers, especially the one that doesn't allow me to enjoy a beer made in Alberta imported into BC?
Yeah, isn't it crazy? This has got to be the craziest thing about Canadian economic structure, is the fact that interprovincial trade is just so tricky. So I'll tell you a story. I have a friend who got married a couple years ago in Prince George, and her best friend was also getting married. So the two of them borrowed a friend's van, and they drove from Prince George east to get to Alberta. They get to Alberta, they find the first Costco they can find. Costco, I forget where they went, Liquor Barn, wherever they went. And they basically filled their entire van with liquor, with beer and wine for their wedding reception. And they drove back. And I'm like, geez, what if you gotten caught? Like, what would happen? It was kind of like Thelma and Louise, right? And they laughed and said, well, we just drove slow. We made sure our headlights were on properly. We just stopped at every stop sign. We just did nothing to attract any attention from a police officer whatsoever. And they managed to get back. And it was like Al Capone's Chicago, right? Smuggling beer and wine across the provincial border. For Pete's sake, it's all Canada. It's crazy that this was something that they had to do. But liquor was so much cheaper in Alberta that it made it worthwhile for them. So, that's kind of the grassroots level. You take these beer companies, craft beer companies, we have some amazing ones in British Columbia. And, it's darn hard to get Blue Buck from Phillips. There's my favorite beer. It's darn hard to get Blue Buck across the border into Alberta or into Ontario. Very few beers make it because it's very expensive, very onerous. The government controls all the liquor distribution boards. Of course, they're incentivized to only stock their own province's beer and wine. This is a big problem. The guy who's done the best job on highlighting this, though, is Dan Albus, the Penticton MP. I think he actually had a hashtag called Free the Beer for a while. And Albus has worked very hard on this. And, we're making baby steps towards actually opening those borders. But, that's just liquor. I'm sure there's other products that have the same issues crossing between provinces. What was there was an agreement between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC that basically let businesses bid on municipal contracts in all of them. But, this is Canada. Like, we don't have border checkpoints between BC and Alberta. Like, why are we doing this for trade? It makes no sense whatsoever. If these free traders are so passionate about free trade and how great it is internationally, why aren't they pushing for more of it within Canada itself? Let's open it up and just treat Canada as single economic unit when it comes to trade.
Well, the British North American Act, which created Canada, said there should be no impediments to trade. And I think it was a New Brunswick man who brought some cases of beer over from Quebec because it was cheaper that brought this whole thing up. And the Supreme, or one of the courts there, ruled that, yes, not allowing interprovincial liquor trade violated the Constitution. I've noticed governments haven't been eager to really appeal that because they don't want a final ruling from the high courts.
Yeah, you're probably right on that. Heaven forbid we have the highest court in the land actually free our beer. Instead, we bother the Supreme Court with all sorts of labor, public sector union trying to constitutionalize their labor rights. So, Yeah, it's a good one, Jim. That's the interprovincial trade. That's something that we want to see more from the premiers, breaking down those walls one by one.
I was going to say two things Canadians care a lot about is the government should not interfere with hockey and it should not interfere with beer.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well, hockey's another one, and this isn't within Canada, but it's more costly. There's duties on Canadian hockey gloves, tariffs on bringing in hockey supplies, hockey equipment. So it's one of those things where we can make life for people a lot cheaper, if we just look at trade with a little bit more of an open feeling.
Should ministers in the government be more personally responsible for their decisions, like a director on a board of directors?
Yeah, this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but you're exactly right. So, if I sit on a board of directors for a charity, we have to go out as a charity. We buy board of director insurance to insure us against decisions. But, ultimately you are, personally liable. You may have insurance to cover it, but you are liable for bad decisions, bad things that go on. And it's a responsibility that people take very seriously. In government, I guess because we can turf them out every 4 years, we've sort of let them off the hook on those kind of things. We understand ideology or good intentions or political philosophy and try to let them be on that. But yeah, like if things are going on, people should be held responsible. I think of, and this isn't to pick on Rob Fleming from Victoria, but there's allegedly an employee there who over 5 or 6 years allegedly stole $150,000 from taxpayers. First of all, if that kind of money can go missing, it tells me that maybe these government offices are overfunded, if no one noticed it for that long. But yeah, should that person be held personally liable for it? They're going to get their day in court, and they've been charged, and there's those issues. But should that person, also be forced to pay it back? That seems pretty fair to the average Joe who scrimped and saved and paid their taxes in order to provide that money.
What about the government accepting untendered contracts?
Yeah, that should be done very rarely and only in emergency situations, and should be done in a very transparent way so people can hold them to account after. Comparison shopping works, right? If you can go out there and get 3 quotes, generally, and these companies know they're quoting against each other, generally you're going to get a better deal. That's just a basic purchasing thing. Go out there, find the cheapest cost, or find the best product, weigh the balance, and pay it. Direct awards should be done very, very sparingly. I also loathe these new things they have where it's like preferred vendor lists. Translink did this where they had 8 or 9 marketing and communications companies on their quote unquote preferred vendor list, and these people were all pre-qualified, so they didn't have to go through other bid processes. I find that to be offensive as well.
And also I've heard about secret sweetheart deals where former government members resign, retire, go off and start working for a private company that all of a sudden seems to get a lot of government work.
Yeah, and part of that is, obviously they know where the bodies are buried and they know how to apply for these things and they know, where that goes. But yeah, that's another reason why you should have a cooling off period for especially senior folks who have been able to set policy. You should have some sort of cooling off period before they go into a business that directly relates to where they used to be on staff.
What's your feeling on Greater Vancouver and a Greater Victoria police force instead of having little individual police forces in 20 or so municipalities in each one of those districts?
This is one I go back and forth on. I was a Township of Langley councillor. I know how important the connection between the local RCMP and the community of Langley was. I also know that we have 2 Langleys. Langley City was a junior partner in the contract with the RCMP, and they didn't pull their own weight. They still don't. The township which is larger, hires more officers. The crime, which is more centered in the denser Langley City, sucks those resources down into there. And I think that's what the fear is, right? That, you know, taxpayers in Belcarra and Anmore and Port Moody and Langley will see their resources being distributed in, you know, higher crime areas like Wally, like the downtown east side. I do like the integrated units. I think that they've proven to give good value. I'd like to see more use of integrated units. Get rid of the transit police, for example, form an integrated unit instead, led by the VPD to police that. I think that could be done a lot cheaper. But full-scale regionalization, I'm just not quite there yet.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to This Week in Money. I'm Jim Goddard. We're speaking with Jordan Bateman, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Jordan, did we ever have a premier who really did have a handle on the taxpayers' money and did do a fair job?
There have been, no premier is perfect, right? You know, WAC Bennett built a lot of infrastructure, but he also nationalized a lot of things. But, you know, obviously British Columbia wouldn't be British Columbia if it hadn't been for WAC Bennett. Bill Bennett was tough on some of the labor side, but maybe a little too tough on some of the social policy issues. The Gordon Campbell of the early 2000s was very different than the Gordon Campbell who just rushed in the HST without, you know, building social license and properly talking to people. You know, you look at the difference between how Campbell handled the carbon tax coming in, which we don't agree with, but you know, he did manage to build social license for, in fact, won an election based on it. You compare that to how he brought in the HST, which was just completely bungled. You know, pretty amazing to think it's the same guy running the ship. So, you know, no premier is perfect. No premier is completely evil either. You know, so they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and that's why we have talk shows like this one where we can hash it out and discuss what they did well and what they did right.
Do governments overall have a lack of consultation with the public, whether it's local homeowners or a First Nations property when it comes to major decisions? I'm just thinking about the 15% foreign buyer tax on Greater Vancouver homes. No consultation there, slapped on at the last second with no warning. Does government tend to do that and not take a look at how it affects individuals or groups of people?
Yeah, government, when they rush things, make bad decisions. You know, the 15% foreign buyer tax really sent a lot of people into a tailspin, well-meaning people who did nothing wrong, not just foreign folks, but Canadian citizens who did nothing wrong and suffered because of it. And there was a way to make it fairer, right? You know, agreements that had been concluded or had been signed off on before the deadline should have been exempt from it. Simple solution that would have made things a lot better. Now, you know, the first 2 weeks of August roll out and, you know, the market crashes, 80% drop in home sales. So, of course, there was a bunch of pent-up demand that went to the end of July. You know, the end of July was probably 80% higher than the July before. So, you know, these things all balance out. Governments need to do a better job of understanding that their policies affect real, average, everyday people. And they need to take a look at, you know, who is being affected by it, how will it affect them, and how can negative things be mitigated, and how can the positive things be better explained. Yeah, you know, no government's perfect when it comes to public consultation. We've seen big leaps and bounds in some ways in the internet age, but in other ways it still comes down to, you know, bureaucrats and politicians who generally, you know, only talk to people like themselves. You know, not understanding that not everyone lives like they live.
Well, governments also seem to forget there's one taxpayer, but they treat you as 5 or 6 different taxpayers. So they'll hike your home taxes by 8%, and then there's a 5% increase in your hydro, and then ICBC hacks, you know, puts on another 6%. Who's getting 6 and 9% pay raises?
Yeah, only government people, I guess. No, you're exactly right. The one taxpayer philosophy is very important. You know, the provincial government actually wrote about it in their budget. There's only one taxpayer, and then completely ignored that philosophy. You know,
how ironic.
And this is the problem, right? With the Trudeau Translink announcement. Yes, 50% is now coming from the federal government. that's still us as taxpayers. And frankly, borrowing billions and billions of dollars and transferring those costs onto our kids' generation through debt. Are we any further ahead? Well, I guess, if you live in the Lower Mainland, you're a little bit further ahead, but everyone else is further behind. So this is the number one thing that I wish, you could lock all of our elected officials, Crown Corporation heads in a room together and get them to understand, is that there is only one taxpayer. And yes, your $4 a month increase to your ICBC rates may not break the bank, but when it's on top of a $12 a month increase to BC Hydro and a $5 a month increase to MSP and a $100 a month increase to your CPP and EI, all of a sudden that's a very heavy burden indeed.
Jordan, thank you very much for being on This Week in Money.
Thanks for having me.
My guest has been Jordan Bateman, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, their website, taxpayer.ca. That wraps up our show for this week. Thanks to our guests, Ross Clark and Jordan Bateman. And thank you for listening. Questions for the show can be emailed to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. We're back next week with more This Week in Money.
Comments made on This Week in Money are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any manner whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Archived online at talkdigitalnetwork.com. This Week in Money is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated. Executive producer is Tom Allen.